The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, look, thank you very much. It's always an honour to speak at any legislation. And this is indeed probably, while not recognised, one of the most significant and important pieces of legislation this House has had in the last couple of weeks at least. Mr Speaker, I jest, but the issue is that primary industries and the rural sector still generates the largest portion of wealth created in this country. And the use of animals, or the management of them, or the care of them, all of those things is at the heart of our economy and of our reputation and our ability to survive into the future. And we have, as the Minister has stated, a good international reputation for animal welfare, and it must continue. The reality is, through social media, we now have an ability to spread good news or bad throughout the world in a very short period of time. And one can say, while not always agreeing, that those who are involved with animal welfare are perhaps some of the most passionate, sometimes misguided, but well-meaning and passionate. And if they want to spread a message, then you can guarantee it goes far and wide very, very quickly. Mr Speaker, I have to acknowledge Shane Ardern, who's not in the House today. He's moved on to greener pastures. He'll be hoping so with a bit of rain up there in the King Country. But he played a significant part in the Primary Production Select Committee for many, many years, and he guided us through. He had some firm views as a dairy farmer that we mustn't push too far into the what you might call domestic arena of animal welfare. And he needed to have that because my colleague Trevor Mallard sat on the committee in place of myself for this piece of legislation. I will acknowledge the changes the Minister's outlined. They are all sensible changes, and for the most part politics didn't play a significant part in the passage of the legislation. Mojo Mathers, on behalf of the Green Party, contributed as well, and there have been, as I said, SOPs put up. Mr Speaker, if we get this wrong, we will pay dearly for our reputation in the international marketplace. As I said, increasing levels of scrutiny and communication mean we can't afford to get anything wrong. However, I do point to an underlying and growing concern, and it's one driven, I guess, by animal rights groups rather than animal welfare groups, and that is that they start demanding some rights or protection for animals that, in fact, we don't see for humans. And I personally am someone who would like to ensure, firstly, that humans have the protection necessary to have fair lives, to have lives free of abuse and of harm and of hurt. And so this bill, tries to find a balance between what is realistic management and what is inevitable in any animal management regime. We've got, of course, the bill doesn't specify the details that many people wanted to submit on, and that many people will still be concerned about, and those will be dealt with through regulations that will be developed as a result of the legislation. And so I'm sure that MPs will be lobbied as we move forward, or as MPI moves forward to develop the regulations from this piece of legislation. Mr Speaker, one thing that is connected to this, but the government has failed to include and ignores it, is country of origin labelling. And Mr Speaker, in doing all these great things for animal welfare and for food safety and for the reputation of New Zealand, it is unbelievable that the national government refuses to endorse mandatory country of origin labelling, as do our Trans-Tasman partners, that would identify the products managed and produced in our country and that could be sold with that reputation that is held in high regard internationally, and that New Zealand consumers also would know whether the meat they were eating was from New Zealand animals or indeed from Australia, which is occurring all too often in the supermarkets today. Mr. Speaker, as I talk to farmers, I say we will always need regulations, we will always need to have high standards, and there will be a cost to your farming operation. But in return for that, Mr. Speaker, I say to them that we should then uphold and promote and ensure that your good efforts are rewarded through better marketplace returns. Yet the national government refuses to acknowledge that one move that would enable New Zealand farmers and producers who have worked hard, who will be working harder, arguably, to meet these standards in this new piece of legislation, but will do so, hopefully, in the knowledge that it maintains and builds further our reputation for the highest levels of animal welfare in the world. And so the consumers of our animal products, will then know, because of the label, that the food that they eat has been produced in the soundest, safest and most ethical ways. Mr. Speaker, the bill enables also mandatory standards for live animal exports to be set in regulations. And again, another issue of some controversy over the years. There hasn't always been good standards in live exports from our country, or indeed from Australia more so, and they've struggled with that. We are seeing more and more dairy animals in particular being exported directly from New Zealand to China in particular, and there's some debate about that, I guess in the same way that we sold off our kiwi fruit, rootstock and plant material, and suffered because of that, because everyone in the world grew the same thing. Then indeed the kiwi cow that the New Zealand dairy industry has developed so well as an efficient producer of milk is now being exported, or its genetics through live exports are now going directly to China. And I'm sure that those people will very astutely and very carefully maximise the value of our exports. Now that's okay, and we're getting rewards for that, but we have to be mindful of the dangers of, firstly, in the live export trade, not looking after them properly, and therefore our reputation's at stake. And then secondly, and perhaps just as more importantly, is of course building the capability of ultimately a country that will be competing with us in terms of dairy production in their own market, and indeed perhaps elsewhere around the world. So New Zealand doesn't have a very good record, I have to say, in wise long-term management in such situations. But this bill will do one thing to try and safeguard that live export trade, and that is to ensure that it's done in a very ethical, safe way for them. Mr. Speaker, if I can go back to a few other issues in the bill, I just say in principle, Labor, of course, will always battle for the high standards of animal welfare, both on the farm and in the towns. And I see my colleague, Mr. Mallard's come here just to ensure that I keep focused on the town issues. I have to say, one of the dangers, as I referred to briefly before, is that if we go for a zero hurt or zero harm approach, then we may indeed see some pretty sad outcomes in terms of animal welfare. And the one of animals used in rodeos is one that has been topical. Sometimes we'll have dogs. I have worked with and have owned some very, very loyal working dogs who run and keep running and work to the point of going beyond pain, I'm sure. I hope that we don't have people running around to check that they run no more than 10.5 kilometres in any 5-hour period, etc. Because we are getting to that point of perhaps extreme protection in some areas of our legislation. And I don't think, it certainly wasn't the intent of the Select Committee, not of Mr. Ardern, and certainly not of myself, that we should move to implement regulations that are bordering on ridiculous. We do have, as I say, the realities of an animal welfare regime overseeing an animal production regime that is built around the breeding, the raising, but ultimately the slaughter of animals, of course, for human consumption. We're not going to get away from that. And so at points in that whole management regime, while this bill attempts to minimise any negatives, there will be some through any reality, just as we do in human behaviour as well, Mr Speaker. I said to my colleague, if we guarantee that there should be no harm to humans, then I guess there'll be none of us going out on the rugby pitch to play a game of rugby that often produces some hurt and some harm. So the Animal Welfare Bill, I think, is a sound approach to a balance between sensible commercial management but protecting not the rights but protecting the welfare of animals as they move through that system, Mr Speaker.